Well, praise the Lord, everyone. Good morning. Y'all who are online, you missed the last couple minutes. We filled out time, but it's good to have everyone. It's good to be in the house of the Lord. And we're going to jump in pretty quick because I've got a lot of stuff to cover, and I don't want to rush, but I want to get to as much as I can. We are on part 4 of our series on parenting, and I knew this was going to be the case, and it always still is. There's so much more I feel like I want to cover, could cover, that I'm going to have time for, but you know, it feels like we can't take a whole year talking about parenting. So if this is something, I'll just add this plug. If this is something you feel like that was great, but I wanted more, I want to go deeper, let me know. I've toyed with the idea of putting together like a longer running 12-week, some other time to really have a discussion, go into depth. So if that's something that would be interesting, let me know, and we'll put something together. But as a way of kind of recapping where we are, we're talking about taking a principled approach to parenting. Every child is different. We'll touch on that here in a bit different. So there's no one size fits all. There's no cookie cutter pattern. Do A, B, C. Here are the instructions. You're good to go. Life changes. Kids change. None of us have raised the kids that we have. None of us lived through the time that our kids are living in. It's all different every time. It's a brand new thing every time. So we have to have some principles that help us to understand how do we navigate the current situation with the current kids, this unique situation. We can have principles that will guide us through that. We talked about 10. We discussed principles. We discussed priorities that God, spouse, family, then ministry and other things. We talked about having a divine responsibility to our children because they are gifts that were given to us from God. We talked about God's incredible respect for free choice. We'll touch on that more. We talked about being intentional in parenting, having a goal. What is the goal of parenting is to raise children that get to adulthood and are fully equipped. I want them to want me, but I don't want them to need me when they get to adulthood. I want to have a relationship, but not a dependent relationship. They should be able to handle their own life. Autonomy versus dependence, this idea that at birth they literally can't do anything. They cannot feed them. They can't even hold their own head up. But by the time I get to adulthood, I want them to be totally independent. How do we navigate that? Because that will happen automatically in some ways, but in other ways it doesn't happen automatically. So there's a bit of nurture, nature, push and pull there. We talked about them being full people, that, you know, it's, and we'll touch on this again here in a little bit. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Parent your children as you would wish to have been parented. Remember that they're full people. We're playing a long game, and then in the lesson that has yet to be uploaded to YouTube, we talked about a foundation of unconditional love. So that was kind of where we came from. Last week, when we began our conversation about discipline, we defined discipline, and for the purposes of our conversation here, discipline we're thinking of as self-control. So it is the ability to make choices purposefully in line with our long-term goals. We talked about it being a goal of instilling right thoughts to lead to right behaviors. I want to teach you how to think and manage your own mind. We talked about this neuroplasticity and being a good steward of our own mind and giving our children and ourselves the tools to actually manage our mental state, such a lacking thing in our world today. I want to teach you how to manage your mind so that you can have self-control, so that you can have good behaviors that lead to what you want. And we talked about discipline as not punishment. That's so often conflated in our world, but discipline is about training and teaching. Can you go back one slide? I'm sorry, Brother Ryan, I ran past. Teaching and growing, not passing judgment. The goal is to correct, equip, and prepare, not to punish or judge. We all have a judge. None of us are currently being judged. There will come a day where we have to give account, and on that day, I'm planning to plead the blood of Jesus Christ. But I'm not the judge for my children. We also touched on neuroplasticity, this idea that neurons that fire together, wire together. How do we manage our own brain? We talked about cause and effect. We'll touch on that. And then appropriate and acceptable behavior. These are kind of our 3 fundamental principles for effective discipline specifically. How do we teach? What are the principles by which we teach? And these are kind of the 3 I would do. So here is a rough overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to get very practical. I'm going to give you kind of 8 practical guidelines for when you're thinking about how do I teach, how do I correct, how do I equip my child? 8 things to think about. So let's go to the first one. Consequences must be felt. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to parenting. particularly at the practical rubber meets the road level. There's a bajillion books on parenting, and we could write more, and they'll be useful because the details always change for every kid. But one of the core principles is this idea of cause and effect. And one of the most important things we can do as a parent is to make sure our children understand and feel the consequences of their actions. This is the way the world works, right? This is the fundamental truth of life. Cause and effect. Something happens, and there is a reaction to it. First law of thermodynamics, every action has the opposite equal reaction. It's a fundamental part of the way that God made the world, and it's a natural consequence of freedom of choice, which is how God designed us. One of the things that I've kind of had as a mantra for myself that I've been trying to instill in my children is this idea, and it'll come up several times today. I can make choices. I can make choices. Right. And that's the first thing that oftentimes the world, the devil, our own mind tries to convince us, I don't have a choice. I can't change anything. I can't fix this. No. I can make choices. I might not feel like I have any good choices, but I can always make choices. The choices that I make have consequences. Amen. Those consequences affect me and others. I can make choices. The choices that I make have consequences. Those consequences affect me as well as others. This is self-evident. If you've lived in life and you've been honest with yourself, you see this naturally. And it's biblical, right? Y'all all know the scripture. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever man sows, that will he also reap. So when we think about discipline, there's broadly two ways, or just education. There's very broadly speaking two ways to learn something. One is, and this is, Ryan, we can stay here. I told him to just try and follow me, but I gave him the slide deck like 5 minutes before church, so I appreciate it. Thank you, Ryan. We can learn something through explanation, through exposition, principles taught to us, instruction given to us by someone else, or we can learn something through experience, right? Through practical trial and error, putting my hands on the wheel and feeling it myself. And truly effective instruction includes both, right? There are some things that can be very effectively taught through instruction and through kind of relaying, and there's some things that you really have to experience to truly understand, but most things of consequence in life, it requires both, right? We know this. We don't always apply it, but we would all think it was pretty foolish of someone to expect to be able to spend, they spend 10 years studying piano, but they never actually put their hands on a piano. Would you expect them to be able to play anything? Probably not. You certainly wouldn't be able to expect them to play well, and it doesn't really matter how long they spend studying it. If they don't actually sit down and put their hands on the piano, they're never going to develop proficiency, right? But similarly, most of us don't expect our kids to derive the fundamental principles of calculus, but that's attainable for all children. It's not easy, but that's one that they need practice to really get it in their head, but it took us thousands and thousands of years to figure that out. So you need to be taught so you don't have to go through all that yourself, figuring it out. So both are important. That's the whole idea behind our education system, right? The same is true in parenting. We have a bit of an advantage in parenting in that life lessons often happen automatically. So a lot of times we just have to take advantage of the opportunities that life has provided. Try to never pass up a teaching opportunity with your children. If they're feeling consequences, make sure they understand them. Use that as an opportunity. Because this is one of the best ways, I would argue this is the best way to parent, is take advantage of opportunities that your children have naturally, help them to think through and grow from those consequences. So one of the most common disciplinary tools that we have is artificial consequences, right? Who can name artificial consequences? Time out. Any others? Artificial consequences. Grounding. Spanking. Any others? Lectures. Taking things away, right? Now, we're only focusing on negative consequences. Are there any artificial consequences that are positive? Ice cream. Bribery. Toys. Expanded freedom, right? Artificial consequences. Your children need to understand that actions have consequences. Their choices have consequences. This is a fundamental part of having personal responsibility and of being effective in the world. If you don't understand that your choices have direct consequences, you will never truly be successful in this world. There's a lot of ways our world is letting you get by. You can kind of skate through, but you will be in this thing where life happens to you, where you're a victim of what happens. And I'm trying to avoid the broader conversation around this because I don't think it's as cut and dry as people put out. But this is a fundamental truth of life. If you want to direct your life, you have to understand my actions have consequences. And then you've got to place that in context, and it's a very big thing, but this is a fundamental truth. So here's the operating principle of consequences and discipline. There are serious consequences, positive and negative, for your behavior, but you're often too young to understand, or these consequences are too far removed for them to be meaningful to you. Therefore, I will create artificial consequences to help you understand the principle of consequences, positive and negative. That is the fundamental principle of consequences and discipline. And if it's when we miss that we get things weird, right? Like when consequences become punishments, it's not really about correcting your behavior. It's about me punishing you for, I'm upset with you and I'm going to punish you, or I'm bribing you and I'm rewarding you. I don't really want them to learn, my goal is not to teach my children to fear punishment, and my goal is not to teach my children to chase reward. But my goal is to teach my children, look, every action you have has a consequence, and you should need to think about that. So, 4 notes about effective use of consequences. Really, and my notes are not highlighting like they're supposed to. Bummer. Oh well. That's why I have these. As much as we can, we should prefer to rely on real consequences, right? We only add artificial consequences when real consequences aren't going to do the thing, when it's not going to be effective enough. So, for example, because this is how the world actually works. So it's much better just to show them how the world works rather than impose something artificial. So an example is screaming and shouting in anger. This was one that we dealt with our children. I don't know if any of your children have been this way, but when they're very small, sometimes when they get mad, they scream and they yell. And they try and exert their will by being louder and more forceful. And, a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old cannot really understand, why do I not want you to scream? Well, there's a lot of reasons I don't want you to scream. Number one, it makes everything more stressful. You're escalating the situation. You're going to make me angry for no other reason than you're attacking me verbally. Number two, the consequence is people don't want to spend time with you. Either they're going to react in an angry way, it's not going to be a productive conversation, you're going to get into fights instead of solve problems. Kids aren't going to want to play with you. If you were an adult and you went through your life screaming at everyone, if you worked for me, I would call you into my office and I'd say, look, if you keep screaming, I'm firing you. Just, I'm not going to work with you. If that's your mode of communication, you're not going to be on my team. Right? That's the consequence, is that you become an unpleasant person to be around, and it's an ineffective way to communicate. A 2-year-old, a 3-year-old cannot possibly understand in that depth. Although, here's a recurring theme, oftentimes they understand more than you think they do. So it's always worth explaining. And that's a good way. If you're trying to figure out what is the line, how do I know if they understood or not? It's kind of like edges in general. How do you know where the edge is? Well, you don't really know where the true boundary is until you bump it, right? Until you toe over the edge and you say, oh yeah, that's where the cliff is. So explain it to them and then watch. Did they actually get it? Do I see they understand by evidence of their behavior? Have I influenced their thinking in a way I can see? And then if you see, no, I haven't, or they don't get it enough, then you introduce consequences. So, for example, this is one where we had to attach artificial consequences, right? If you scream, I'm going to send you to your room until you stop screaming. Because that's unacceptable behavior. That is the consequence of your action. Another one, for example, is with my son right now, and I think he'd be okay with me sharing this. I'm pretty sure he would. He's just gotten to high school, and it's not that grades didn't matter. We always kept grades, but more so now than ever, his grades matter. And so he likes to play video games, and our general rule is during school year, you don't play during the week. You have an hour and a half on the weekend. That's when you can play. Well, I've told him, if you get C's, I will reduce the amount of time you have. If you get B's, we'll talk about things. But if you get A's, I will increase the amount of time I give you. Because what you're showing me, the principle is you must work before play. You have to take care of the things that matter before you entertain yourself. Entertainment's not bad, but if it gets in the way of actually making progress in life, like that's the problem that a whole generation has, is I make all these accomplishments in a world that's not real. Right? So you have to do your work before you play. If you show me that you understand that principle and that then I will help augment the natural consequences of your good choice or of your bad choice, right? So as much as possible, prefer to rely on the real consequences. Second, and always, before I go on them, make sure there are consequences, right? Always explain the actual consequences. And as soon as you're convinced that they understand the actual consequences, switch to those. Like, I don't have to be the disciplinarian if you're being disciplined by life. And as long as I can make sure you understand what's happening, right? If you do something and it leads to negative behavior, I'm not going to pile on. I'm just going to make sure you feel, I'm not going to let you avoid. And sometimes as parents, because we love our children, we want to protect them, we shelter them from natural consequences. That is a serious mistake. We help them deal with the effects of the natural consequences. But we don't shelter them from natural consequences because they need to learn how to make good choices. And if you shelter them, they're missing that feedback. That was a bad choice. I should do something different. So don't shelter them from consequences. Help them in their consequences.
Brother Jonathan, I have a brother-in-law who, as a late teenager, him and a bunch of guys decided to go into this little convenience store and help themselves to some candy and Coke. They got caught. There was 4 boys involved. The sheriff came to my father-in-law and said, "Hey, we can excuse him from the consequence. I know who you are. You'll take care of it." And my father-in-law, much different from the other 3, said, "No. What are the consequences?" "Well, normally for petty theft like this, he would spend a couple weeks in jail and et cetera." He said, "Okay, that's what we want to do." And he said, "Well, Mr. Broussard, there's no reason." He said, "Oh yeah, there's plenty of reasons. I want him to realize what he did." And the other 3 boys, they didn't spend any time in jail then. They spent a lot of time in jail later. Right. But that was the end of it for him. He felt the natural consequences and he changed his behavior. So
We can all think of examples, of high-profile examples, of people that do stuff, and the natural reaction from most people is their parents never, like daddy always bailed them out, right? We're so willing to throw that on other people, but bring it home. Don't bail your kids out. Help your kids. Help your kids. And one of the things that I'll touch on here briefly as well, is like we need to there's 2 separate goals as parents that they're in conflict a little bit. One is this teaching discipline aspect. I want them to learn the truth. I want them to learn how to be self-sufficient, be able to manage themselves, all this. The other is I want to protect them from harm. And the truth is, a lot of times their poor choices lead to harm. And we have to be careful that we don't allow that desire to protect them from harm, immediate harm, to prevent them from having effective discipline. So my general rule for myself with regard to the protecting thing is I will not allow them, especially while I have control, and we'll touch on freedom of choice here in a second. In general, my policy is I'm going to let them do whatever they can do, except I will not, and then they'll face the consequences, right? They'll do whatever they want. There's going to be consequences. We'll talk about it. But I will not allow them, I will constrain their freedom in cases where they would do irreparable harm to themselves. If they're going to make a choice that we can't fix, I'm going to prevent them from making that. But if we can fix it, I'd rather you make the choice, suffer the consequence, and then let's fix it, right? So that you can learn, and so I can, because there's value in the process of fixing it. Like I've made mistakes since being adult. Have y'all made mistakes since being adult? You're going to screw it up sometimes. You're going to fail. So you need to learn just as much how to avoid bad choices as what to do when you make a bad choice. How do you get out? What do you do? They need that experience. All right, so avoid being arbitrary. When you create artificial consequences, make sure that you tie those artificial consequences to the behavior that's being done. So, don't just be arbitrary, because what I'm not trying to teach them to avoid punishment. I'm trying to teach them the principle of their behavior. So if I can, I tie, so the screaming, for example, that's a great example. The real consequences are too long-term, too abstract for them to connect. But what I'm saying is, right now, you are acting in a way that is socially unacceptable. I will remove you from a social situation until you have determined you're going to act socially acceptable. And at that point, you can come back out. I'm not punishing you. I'm not, it's not me being vengeful because you hurt my ears and I'm mad at you. It's that you are acting in a way that is not appropriate for the situation. Now, I could let you keep screaming, and there will be longer-term consequences, but you don't understand. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to impose an artificial consequence, but it's directly tied to your behavior. The problem is you're acting in a way that's not appropriate. So I'm going to remove you from the situation until you can act appropriate. We'll come back to that one here in a minute. Be predictable. This one is very important. Give a pass. If someone does something poorly the first time, give them a pass. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they're children, right? If my kid spills milk, it's probably not because they meant to spill milk on the floor. It's because they weren't being careful, they weren't paying attention. So I'm not going to get mad at them, discipline them for spilling milk. I'm going to teach them, look, okay, this is why we use a sippy cup. Or this is why, if you're going to use a real cup, you do this. And then no negative consequences. I'm not going to discipline them anyway. The discipline is teaching them what to do right. Now, if they go back and continue to act in a way they know is a poor choice, like when the kid decides they're going to throw the milk on the floor, that's different than when they're just handling a cup and they spill it, right? We'll go back to that principle. I'm not going to give my kid a glass cup. They can't handle it. That's a freedom I'm denying them until they can handle it, right? That's how I reconcile this, allowing them to do with protecting them from harm. So, be predictable. This actually, this is, well, let me give you an example, right? Coming back to shouting as our working example. I want to make sure they have a clear understanding of the consequences before I let them go, when I'm teaching them, and before I impose consequences next time. And I want confirmation that they understand. We don't shout in anger. Why don't we shout in anger? We've had this conversation. I've sat down and I've talked to my 3-year-old, my 4-year-old, whenever they're at the point where they can understand. Why do we not shout in anger? Because it always makes things worse. That's right. Because it doesn't help. That's right. What is the consequence of shouting in our house? Being sent to my room. That's right. So next time you shout, what's going to happen? You're going to send me into my room until I calm down. You have that conversation, and that's a very shortened version of that conversation. Sometimes that conversation takes a long time to have. But you're trying to get to that end point where they understand, and this is where you have to be patient, you have to be calm and stay calm yourself, especially when they don't get it. It can be very frustrating, but you're shooting for, I want shared understanding of the expected behavior and of the consequences. So next time when this happens, you don't get shocked, and they're going to act shocked. What do you mean you're setting my, it's not fair? No, it is. It's completely fair. Didn't we talk about this? Didn't I tell you what would happen? Well, yes, but blah, 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 blah. I'm not arguing. Go to your room. This is such a powerful tool. It works even in adulthood, right? Now I'm making them accountable to me for their behavior. We have an agreement. So this shared active agreement, actually, this idea of shared active consent to agreements is so powerful. It even works when your rules are ego-driven and arbitrary. You will get compliance even when it's ego-driven. Now, you'll destroy the relationship, so I'm not suggesting you have ego-driven arbitrary rules, but this idea of shared agreement and compliance is incredibly powerful. Yes, Dad's rules are weird, I don't understand them, but I can't say I didn't know them. He told me, right? And like I said, this is such an amazing tool, it even works in adult settings. I have used this to huge effect and been humorously, it tickles my brain. In like project management, especially if I'm working with like external vendor, or if I'm the external vendor and I'm working with a company and they want us to do X, Y, Z, I'll tell them, okay, if you want me to build the thing, I require, in order to build this, I require this information, or I require this piece, that you guys own this, right? You don't want us to build this. No, this is our thing, we want to build this. And okay, great, that's yours. I need that for this, and it's going to take me 3 months. Whenever I get that, I'm going to need 3 months, my team, to build this. So you understand, right? We agree that when we get this, it's a 3-month lead time for us. Yes. Okay, and you're going to have this on January 1st. Yeah, we'll have that on January. Okay, let's push it out to March just to make sure if there's, is that okay? We agree? Okay, so now we understand. You're going to give us this on March 1st. We commit. If you give us this on March 1st, we will have that available on July 1st. But if we miss the date on March 1st, then we have no guarantee of giving you that on July 1st. And in fact, even the 3-month guarantee might be out the window because I might have other priorities, I might have other projects, but this is our agreement, right? Yes, okay, all good. Then it comes to March 5th, and they deliver it, and they're going to throw a big fit, but I can say very clearly, look, I'm sorry. I feel bad. I wish I'm on your side. Yes, I agree, but we had this agreement. And because you failed to meet the expectations, I can't guarantee you. It's such a powerful tool. Get their active, informed agreement to the behavior before you enforce consequences. The last bit on consequences before we move on, because this is probably the biggest part of the lesson, is consequences need to be consistently applied in order to be effective. And this is one of those that I hate because it doesn't give me a pass. I know in my own life how many times I've heard someone say, well, you have to be consistent with your discipline. I'm like, I know, but it's so hard. Well, yes, it is. I'm not, like if you're inconsistent with your discipline, I'm not upset with you. I'm not judging you. It's just not going to be effective. It's a consequence of your actions. And it works for us too. If I want my discipline and my consequences to be effective, they have to be consistent. If they're inconsistently applied, they're not going to be effective. Because what you're teaching your children is this isn't actually real. It's only real when I feel like it, or it's only real when I have bandwidth. And actually, I'll give a little bit of a tip here. That's a totally valid thing to do. Like I remember a time our kids wanted to go swimming. And it was like 8 o'clock at night. And their bedtime's 9:30. And they're like, we'll go swimming, we'll come home at 9. And we'll get ready for bed, we'll be ready for bed for 9:30. On the face of it, yeah, I'd love to do that. But the truth is, I'm tired. And I'm ready to go to bed myself. And what I know about you is you're unlikely to actually come home at 9. I'm probably going to have to go over there and get you home or enforce consequences if you don't come home. And I don't have the bandwidth. I can't do that. I know this about myself, that I will be unable to enforce my consequences. So I'm just telling you, no, now you cannot go swimming. And that led to a big argument and a big fight. Why not? We have time. We can, we've gone swimming in the past. I know, but of course they were old enough I was actually able to explain this and lay it at their feet. Really, if I could trust you, well, you can. We'll do it this time. Well, you didn't do it the last 5 times. Consequence of your previous actions. If I could trust you, so here's what we're going to do. This time, no, and we're not going to argue about it. There's nothing you can do to change my mind. What you can do to change my mind is next time, you show me. And then next time this happens, we can have a different conversation. So be consistent. And be wise about your consistency, right? Don't put yourself in a position where you're going to be unable. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go to the next one, Ryan. Freedom of choice. This is part of that fundamental principle I talked about, right? I can make my own choices. My choices have consequences. The consequences of my choices affect other people. So I should make choices with the consequences in mind. So here's the thing. This is a God thing. Think about it. When can anybody here think of any time in Scripture where God punished someone for something they might do? Or they were going to do but hadn't done yet? This is such a weird thing when you think about it. The God of the universe, who cannot abide sin, has never prevented people from making sinful choices. He has allowed us to make sinful choices, and then there's consequences for those choices. But this idea that we have freedom of choice is God-given. It is fundamental to our relationship with our Creator, that He has given us creative power in the freedom of choice. So we have to be very careful, I think, when we constrain our own children's choices. We should allow our children to exercise their freedom of choice, because this is part of how we train them to make good choices. This is one of those I said, you can learn things by being taught, or you can learn things by experience. You cannot learn, like piano, you cannot learn how to make good choices without practice making choices, which means you're going to make bad choices. And you have to let your children make some bad choices. It requires both instruction and practice. You can teach them all day, but if they never practice, they won't develop the ability. And you see this with some people. Well, I taught them right. Yeah, but they didn't actually live their life until they became 18, and they went totally off the rails. Are you surprised? They never actually had a chance to practice. But on the other hand, they can make choices. And clue for those who think, like, they will make choices. Your children will make their own choices. They will have their own mind about things. You can constrain them, but they will still make choices. But if we don't teach them, they won't always understand how those choices connect to the consequences. They won't appreciate the outcomes that they've sown some things in their life, and they'll be surprised when the results come, because you didn't teach them. So it requires both. So what I would suggest to you is never, or maybe not never is very strong, try not to prevent your children from making a recoverable mistake. If it can be recovered from, let them make a mistake. Be prepared to help them when they make the mistake. Be prepared to help them recover. But I'm not going to let my toddler run in the street and get hit by a car, right? I'm going to prevent them from doing that. But I am going to let my toddler make some choices about what they play with, even though, if you run, you're going to hurt yourself. I've warned you. But I might let them run in the house until they hit the wall, and I told you it was going to hurt. This is why we don't run in the house, right? We do that to toddlers. We stop doing it when they get older. I don't know why. There's a tactic we sometimes use, particularly on small children, especially when they get to like 2 or 3 and they start asserting their own independence. How many of y'all have ever done this? Actually, that's natural, by the way. Them getting to 2 and 3 and saying no and asserting their own, that's part of how God made them. That's part of how they develop their own identity, their independence from you as a separate being. I'm not like just an appendage to mom, which you don't want them to be an appendage to you. That gets very tiring very quick. You want them to be independent, as much as that pulls on your heart sometimes. So it's natural. So, they start making their own choices, and there's this tactic. How many of you have done this? You want them to drink milk. You know they're going to argue. So what you do is you say, hey, do you want to drink your milk from a blue cup or the green cup? And then the kid's like, ooh, I get to make a choice. I'm in control. I want to drink my milk from the green cup, Mom. Yes. How long does that work?
It works a long time because that's exactly what salespeople do when they want you to buy something. Yep. So it's the same exact thing.
Sometimes they outgrow the simple choices, but the pattern doesn't go away. And this isn't just parents manipulating their children. This actually is teaching them how to make decisions. I'm giving you a choice within acceptable parameters. Here are the acceptable parameters. You're drinking the milk. That's the reality of what's going to happen. But I will let you choose what cup you use. Don't you wish your boss would do this? Hey, I want this report on X, Y, and Z. We need a count of sales from last quarter. You can probably get it from the Salesforce database. You might be able to poll our salespeople. I don't actually care how you do it. This is just what I need. Wouldn't that be great if your boss would communicate with you that way? Hopefully many of you have bosses like outcome-oriented, right? Here's what I'm expecting, freedom within those parameters. This is a good thing for teaching children. This is, this also illustrates the principle, I'll take a little bunny trail here, which is seek the win-win. Like, don't create unnecessary confrontation. Let me back up. I've done this. I've looked back at my own past and I've done this, where my kid gets upset about something. And my default is, you shouldn't be upset about that. Or I asked you to do this, so you're going to do that. And then we get in this fight, and they're like, no, I don't want to. And they dig in their heels, and you're going to, blah, 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 blah. And it comes out like, did they actually need to do that? Well, no. Like, maybe I wanted them to drink milk, but maybe they could have had a bowl of cereal instead. And maybe that's all they were arguing for. It's like, I don't want to drink just milk. I want to eat cereal. Okay, that's fine. Like, don't go out of your way to have a fight. If there's a way around the fight that accomplishes your goals, take that instead. Because the goal is to teach them. The goal is we're not trying to dominate our children. And there's this idea as well, right? Like, I have never heard someone come out and say it, but there's so many people, it seems like this, whether like you have to break your children's will. Particularly if they're strong-willed, like if they're really rebellious, you just have to break their will. You have to show them that they're not in control, that I'm in control, and that no matter what they do, I will win. That, in my personal opinion, is a horrible way to build an effective relationship with your kid. Now, the challenge is you often have these dominant struggles, and it is true. I am the parent. You are not the parent, and you have to understand this fact of reality. I am the parent. But I'm not trying to break your will. I'm trying to help you express it within parameters that are acceptable. And so it's a nuance, because I think most people aren't really trying to dominate their kids' will. They're trying to make sure they do what's appropriate. But we have to recognize that the kids, if you have a strong-willed child, and that's I'm going to win, you're not. Not long-term. You will not win long-term. You can win now, but you will lose long-term.
It just reminds me, and if you're going to it later, I apologize. But Ephesians chapter 6, we always let adults and parents teach this section, and so we get emphasized on children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. That's the part we emphasize. But there is a verse number 4, of that same chapter, in the same thought, that says, fathers, don't provoke your children. Right. Like, don't go out of your way to pick a fight with them. Don't just do it just because you're the big guy and you can. It says, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So there is a distinction that there is other disciplines and instructions other than the Lord's that you could bring them up in,
Right.
which is yours. But if you want to bring them up in the instruction and discipline of the Lord, then don't provoke them unnecessarily.
Right. Right. You will not win that fight long term. And that's not really what you want, where you want to be. I said this at the beginning, and I'll bring it up now again. We had this comparison, right? This contrast. For unconditional love depends entirely on the giver of the love. The object, the recipient of the love, has no influence on the love. I can love someone regardless of how they feel for me. I'm going to love my kid no matter what they do. I might not approve of their choices. They might damage our relationship, but there's nothing they can do that will change the way I love them. Discipline is the opposite. Discipline is not about me. There's nothing about my discipline that should be dependent on me. It's about them. It's about what's good for them. How do I teach them? How do I correct them? So we're getting close to the end. And I have a couple other things I wanted to touch on. Those are the two biggest ones I think that would, if you can internalize those two principles, consequences for actions, and teaching that effectively, and respecting their freedom of choice within a framework of discipline, that goes a long way. But let me give you some other more practical tips as well. Ryan, go ahead and the one after freedom of choice. Is that the one after freedom of choice? I can't remember my slides now. Yeah, okay. I think I added too many. No, go back to the one with the flowers. I apologize. I'm making them go back. All right, so we talked about consequences that must be felt, preserving freedom. The next thing is choose sustainable tools of discipline. I touched on this a little bit, so I won't go into it deeply. But don't set up a dynamic you can't sustain or that's not going to achieve what you want. For example, if you choose to spank as an artificial consequence, it's a really bad idea to do that as a discipline for anger and defiance. Because what's going to happen? You're going to spank your child because they're being angry and defiant, which is going to make them more angry and more defiant, which leads you to spank them again because that's the consequence you set up. So if you're going to be consistent, you have to apply the consequence. And pretty soon you're just beating your child, right? I think there is I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it today, but there is a place for spanking, I think. You have to be careful with spanking. It can be, but every effective tool of discipline can be abusive if it's misapplied. But don't set up a dynamic you can't maintain. Another example, I don't like consequences that last more than a week. For a couple reasons. Number one, I don't really think it sticks with a kid. And number two, I don't trust myself to be able to maintain it, right? Like, I have a job. My wife has a house to maintain. I'm busy. My kids aren't. They're going to outlast me. If the behavior is serious enough to warrant an artificial consequence, then the artificial consequence ought to be serious enough to correct the behavior. Otherwise, don't do it, right? Don't tiptoe around. Make the consequence meaningful so the behavior is addressed. And think it through before you promise to do something, good or bad, right? If you promise consequences for, like, if you do this, I'm going to do this. Or if you do this, I'll buy you this. Like, if I promise, hey, if you go to Sunday school and you behave in Sunday school, I'm going to buy you a toy. Be careful, because you're going to be going to Toys R Us every Sunday. They'll believe you. Wow, Mom, they promised a toy. Or, my son, he's saving up for a laptop. So I was telling him the benefits of working. And he was like, well, hey, if I did this, would you get me a laptop? No. Sorry, bud. That would not be effective. I want you to learn a little bit more than that. We don't want to be prison wardens, and we don't want to be vending machines.
He was actually working on the art of negotiation. You just didn't realize that's what he was doing.
Yeah, he's trying to anchor me high. I know. The goal of discipline and parenting is to instill good values, to give them the tools to succeed, and to have self-control, not to be in control. The goal of successful parenting is they are in control of themselves, right? Ideally, I'm not enforcing consequences at all. I'm just guiding them through choices that they are making. All right, let's touch on some of these real quick. Be outcome-oriented. As I mentioned, as long as I get the outcome I'm looking for, I'm happy. Let's say I've put them in timeout and I've told them, look, because you were antisocial, you have to go here. And like, if you have to be there 30 minutes, you have to be there. 5 minutes later, they have decided, you know what? I don't want to be here. It's not cool. I want to play. I'm going to calm myself down. I'm going to figure it out. Hey, Dad, can I go play? Are you going to be calm? Are you going to get in a fight? No, I'm good. Okay, yeah. Well, you said I had to be here 30 minutes. Yeah, but you learned. You're good. That was what I was shooting for. I'm not trying to make you miserable. I'm trying to help you understand. You understand. Great, go for it. If you choose spanking, let me I might have to take a portion and just touch on that one because I think it's very important. If that's a discipline you're going to choose, don't do it immediately. Give them time. Give yourself time, because it can't be, if you're going to use that as a tool, it has to be done for discipline, not out of anger. That's the danger. So if you can't take 30 minutes and wait till you've calmed down and thought through, and is this actually what I want to do, then you don't need to be doing it. The other side is, that gives them 30 minutes to regret their choices. That is a very effective tool. That's the way the world works. Have you ever, any procrastinators? You ever wake up in the morning and you remember you have a test that you didn't think about, and now you're dreading it until you take the test? Do you ever mess up on your job and like I don't know about you, when I make a mistake, I go to my boss immediately and hey man, I screwed up, you need to know, let's fix it, how do we fix it, what do we do? But if you don't, you're just waiting, and that sword of Damocles is hanging over your head, just waiting to fall, right? That's a good thing. Now what happens if you've promised them, if you do this, you're going to get a spanking, and they, in that 30 minutes, they come to a real repentance, and they become very contrite, and they are, if I'm convinced you're sincere, okay, I'll let it go. No spanking.
That was Landon's punishment. He never quite figured that out. He thought what he did after that was the punishment.
Right.
The punishment for Landon
was the waiting.
You have to think about it.
Yeah, you have to think about it. Now, if they are manipulating, then, you told me last time you were repentant and you weren't, so I'm sorry. I appreciate your contrition, but you're going to have to prove it to me a little longer. Again, I'm not sure that, I'll touch on it here. I know I'm very at time. Be outcome-oriented. Invest enough time to be effective. Let me just say it this way. We will make time for our work emergencies, right? Hey, honey, I'm sorry, I'm staying late. There's an emergency at work. I've got to take care of it. It's important. Yeah. Why don't we ever make time for parental emergencies? I have been late to work, and I called my boss and I let him know, hey, look, I'm going to be late. I'm sorry. I have a situation at home I have to deal with right now. Because there was something that happened, and I needed to talk it and finish this conversation so that it happened in a time that was effective for my children. I've rescheduled meetings now that I'm working from home, because what I recognize is there's a problem. I need to get involved and do effective discipline, and that's more important than my work right now. Now, there's a balance like everything else, but how many of you worked for companies there's always a fire? How do you fix that? How do you fix when there's always a fire?
I try to put boundaries.
Effective boundaries.
Deal with the thing that you need.
Treat the underlying cause. If you don't treat the underlying cause, there will always be a fire. And there are some cultures that create fires. Don't do that in your parenting. Deal with it up front so you don't have constant emergencies with your kids, right? So be prepared to invest the time. This next one, effective discipline is child-led. I told you that comparison, right? Unconditional love is about me loving them. Discipline is about them making good choices. So that principle, I can make my own choices. My choices have consequences. My consequences affect me and others. Another way I'm trying to say it, I'm trying to teach you, my child, how to have self-control. If you demonstrate the ability to control yourself, you opt out of my consequences entirely. If you're in control, then you're navigating life, and I'm just here to help you. It's when you're out of control that I have to step in. Example here, real briefly, when Elijah was young, he would get very emotional and upset, and he'd get upset to the point where he'd start hitting himself. And he would hurt himself because he's too angry, or he's too sad, or whenever he got too emotional. So my response was, I would physically restrain him. I'd hold his arms, I would sit with him, and I would, you got to be careful with that, because that's a very dominating thing I'm doing to him. I am restricting him entirely. But what I was doing is, and I would tell him this, Elijah, you're out of control. As soon as you are in control, I will let you go. As soon as you can calm down, I will let you go. Because it's about you being in control. It's not about me controlling. You are in control. And this is one of those fundamental principles for all your discipline. If you don't like the discipline, change it. Make different choices. It's not about me. It's not about me winning. It's not about my will. It's about your choices. I will be that impassable wall as long as you keep making poor choices. But as soon as you make the good one, I'm out of the way. I don't need to get revenge. I don't need to get back. If you demonstrate you got it, good. Effective discipline is child-led. Be fair. The world isn't fair. Your children will have lots of natural opportunities to learn that fact. The world will show them it's not fair. But as much as possible, I'm going to be fair. Specifically, I'm going to be fair to them, which we touched on this, right? Like the being predictable. They should know what's going to happen before it happens, so they have a chance to choose, right? Be fair. Now, we can't always be fair, right? I don't treat my children all the same because they're not all the same. They're different kids. They do different things. They need different from me. But I try my best not to show favoritism. Be fair. And this last one I'll end with for today. And then, y'all let me know. Should we keep going on discipline? Should we do one more on discipline and push some of this? Okay, we'll do that. And we'll talk about the actual, what artificial consequences do we create, good and bad? What are the effects? How do we use them effectively? I'll end with this. Be careful. One of the reasons you have to be intentional with your discipline is if you're not, your children will train you to be mean to them. I'll give you an example. Kid is playing on his game in the computer, right? He's got his Switch on the couch, and mom tells him, hey, in 30 minutes you need to get off and go do your, clean your room. 30 minutes comes by, he's not off. Mom comes by, hey, you need to get off. It's time to get off. Okay, Mom, I'm finishing up, I'll get off. She leaves. She comes back later, hey, it's 10 minutes later, hey, I told you to get off. Okay, Mom, I'm getting off now. And she leaves. Finally, what does Mom do? You'd better get off that thing right now or I'm going to tan your hide. I'm going to call your dad, whatever, right? And Mom explodes, and Mom yells, and now Mom's angry, and it's this whole thing. Oh, fine, Mom, I'm off. Done, right? The kid ignored you until what point? Till you showed anger, right? Now, that's one way to read. The kid ignored you until you showed anger. No, the kid ignored you until you actually got involved, right? Another way that could have gone is, hey, you need to get off for 30 minutes. Okay, Mom, I will. I would probably give a 5 minutes, especially if you know they have a problem with this, give them a 5 minute. Hey, it's 5 minutes, and if you don't get off in 5 minutes, you have 5 minutes to get off, right? They ignore you. Okay, now it's 30 minutes. And instead of Mom coming in and saying, hey, it's time to get off, and the kid says, okay, I will, and Mom walks away, Mom says, hey, I told you it's time to get off. Okay, no, I'm taking it now, and you take it from them. And you're calm, right? But what happens if we're not careful is you don't get compliance until you throw a fit. And if you repeat that behavior, you're teaching the children it doesn't matter until Mom gets angry. So I get what I want until Mom's angry. And now you've trained them that the only effective way to get through them is to yell at them and scream at them. Right? The same thing happens with other poor behaviors as well. Now that's not, the issue there is that Mom didn't have clear, it could be Dad, I'm not trying to pick on Mom. The parent didn't have clear boundaries, expectations, and consequences, and didn't enforce those clear boundaries and expectations. But if we will do that, if we will be intentional about the consequences, if we will be intentional about following up, investing the time, we can avoid those things. I hope this has been helpful. We may push a week. We'll see. Like I said, I feel very passionate about this subject. We can build strong families. Amen. We can teach children and equip them not just to get by, but to overcome, to be successful, to be able to make their own choices and chart their own path in life. I love you. I hope this has been useful. We will take a few minutes. We'll get into our main service, and God bless.